Welcome to Perspectives 360, where we look back at the top 4 Catholic stories of the week, then follow up with a review of all the topics that we'll talk about today. I'm your host, Noel Okel, and let's take a look now at the first stories that we'll talk about tonight.
The 2018 Met Gala, Heavenly Bodies, was it outreach or was it outrage? A 71-year-old Australian nun was kicked out of the Philippines for that? Was the government in the right? Talking about the devil too often. Could it hurt our progressive Pope's credibility? German bishops allowing Protestants who are married to a Catholic to receive communion in the Catholic Church. Is this the proverbial crack in the dam?
Okay, let's have a look at some of our panelists tonight. First of all, welcome Emily Callan, the producer at Salt and Light.
Hi, Noel.
Next up on the list is Sebastian Gomes, who's also a motorcycle avid rider, and Allison Kenny, the future host of Catholic Focus. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Noel.
Okay, we got a bunch of interesting stories to talk about tonight, but before we begin, let's take a look at the first story in a little more detail.
Papal pomp and Catholic circumstance was on display for all the world to see at this year's Met Gala in New York City on Monday. It met with some confusion but optimisms amongst Catholics as movie stars and celebrities dressed up in Catholic-themed outfits, from the outrageous to the all-out weird. The theme for this year's event was Heavenly Bodies, Fashion and the Catholic Imagination.
All right, so first question I'm going to throw to Emily. Was the Met Gala sacrilegious? What do you think?
I have mixed opinions about it, Noel.
As do most.
I would have to say yes and no to that question.
Okay.
I think that if you're, when I was first seeing the images, on social media and following the Met Gala, there were some people who were arriving on the red carpet where I was amazed. I was actually in awe of the I probably shouldn't call it a costume because it's a fashion event,
Okay.
and so the designs that were prepared for that event were beautiful. They really were. If you really just look at it from a fashion point of view, from an artistic point of view, but of course, as a Catholic, there were some of the designs that appeared, which created a kind of it was a little bit, were disturbing because they were a little bit scandalous. I think that, Cardinal Dolan, when he gave his press conference, he said some beautiful things about the fact that the church is present because, where beauty is, God is also, right? And I think that the Catholic, what's incredible is that people can take. When we think of Catholic imagination, we think of beauty, we think of, these intricate designs.
I'm going to interrupt there for a
Sure.
second, Emily. But if you take a look at some of the images that came on social media, they were
Right.
really scandalous stuff. I mean, we couldn't show some of them on the network because I'd lose my job. But the fact is that would a Muslim or any other religion be as tolerant as we Catholics are if there was
Probably
a Met
not.
Gala that showcased a sexy Mohammed?
There's a certain kind of, I don't want to say like laissez-faire about Catholicism and its interaction with culture, right? I mean, we put up with a lot. There's a lot of different groups that kind of make fun, poke fun, or are downright hostile to Catholicism, and we kind of turn the other cheek. That's kind of the way that Catholics in society respond. But I don't think that there was any like malintent with this whole thing at the Met Gala, you know what I mean? Like, does anybody think, like, even as ridiculous as some of the celebs looked in those weird outfits, the
Jesus
fashion statement that they were making? Yeah. I mean, are we really going to looking at them and saying, oh, they're out to, stick it to the church, or like they hate the church so much that they're trying to make like, a statement? So for me, I think you need to separate the fashion, like, show from the actual exhibition, which is also part of this whole thing. And apparently, I mean, I haven't gone there to see it, but apparently if you actually go into the exhibition, it's a really well thought out educational experience that gives a lot of context about the Catholic imagination historically with art, investments, and that kind of thing.
So here's one question then. Do you think that the Vatican would have given those exhibitions to the Met if they had known that there would be some kind of... Sorry, yeah.
I was just gonna say, I'm sure that the Vatican was well aware of the kinds of things that would come up during this Met Gala. I don't think that this is the first time that, you know, Catholicism is taken, you know, into secular culture. We see it in movies, we see it in literature. It's all over the place, right? Like, there is something about the Catholic imagination that people are very intrigued about. And so I don't think that officials at the Vatican were thinking, oh yeah, like this is, again, the exhibition, like you said, Sebastian, was really well done. My question is more about the red carpet and the kind of imagery and designs that were there. And my question is, can we separate something that's the content of an image? So when we look at an image in a Mary, when we look at a nativity, when we're looking at, you know, there was a, I forget who it was that arrived dressed as Mary with the swords in the heart, right? Right, exactly.
Who is Catholic.
There you go. So can you take, you know, the meaning and the content from that? Or is it possible to separate it, or are those things always going to, you know? And so to put that on let's say a celebrity who's half dressed, right? What kind of message is that sending? That's the question I was having. The exhibition, I know, was something different, and I know it was very well done, but that's where
you were divided.
A little concerned, yeah.
Okay, so then I want to add this last comment on this topic. I don't see how that is any different, personally, than a bunch of kids dressing up on All Saints Day, okay?
I think that there's a little bit more reverence, though, on All Saints Day. I think that it's actually meant to celebrate the saints, right? Like there's, when families and children are dressing up for it.
All right, so listen, we got to move on to our next story. Thank you for that. So let's have a look at the context of the next story.
Australian nun Sister Patricia Fox is being forced out of the Philippines by the government. She is accused of being involved in what the government claims are anti-government protests. The 70-year-old nun, who has been in the Philippines for the past 30 years serving the country's poor, is now having her missionary visa revoked and has been given 30 days to leave the country.
All right, Sebastian, I'm going to throw this one to you. Was the government right in kicking out a nun whom they perceived as breaking the law? Mind you, the nun wasn't a citizen of that country.
Right. I mean, I think with Sister Patricia, it's pretty clear that she's doing what a lot of men and women, religious and lay Catholics, are doing all over the world. I mean, they're working with people who need help, who need to be encouraged, whose lives need to be developed in some way. And she's not doing anything extraordinary. I mean, from what I read, you know, she's standing up in solidarity with farmers who are, you know, struggling to secure their lands, secure their agricultural rights. She's standing up with day laborers, you know, people who just want respectable work, which are both things, food and work, that the Catholic Church stands with.
So the impression I'm getting is that no, the government wasn't right.
Well, I mean, you know, the other side.
Remember,
the other side of this.
Her terms of her missionary visa.
Right. According to the government.
According to the
Let's look at the government. I mean, who is the government that is actually kicking her out? I mean, you have a president who calls Pope Francis and other leaders sons of whores. Yep. You know, 12,000 extrajudicial killings of, you know, against the drug cartels and everything that are taking over the Philippines. You know, along with suppression of journalists, attacks on schools. I mean, Duterte's government looks a lot like the military dictatorships of Latin America of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, Absolutely. Right? So, you know, to ask the question, I think we also have to say, what's the context here, you know? And like, is Sister Patricia a threat to that kind of government? Any Catholic is a threat to that kind of government if you're standing up for human rights.
But the only difference, though, is that the Latin American governments of the 60s and 70s, they were killing off nuns. They were killing off priests. She just simply got you know, the government felt that she was doing something that she wouldn't, and she just got booted out.
I guess we can call that slight progress, but you got to look at the whole picture here. I mean, like, if you're gonna, you know, put one of the Met Gala halos on Duterte, I don't think that's a good idea.
Good points. Alison, any thoughts? Should missionaries be involved in the politics of their country that they're visiting?
I guess ultimately, Noel, it comes down to who is your allegiance to? Is your allegiance to a worldly power, or is your allegiance to the gospel?
Right.
And if we're following the example of Christ as Catholics, and if you are a dedicated individual who's going out there into the missionary field, you are giving supremacy to Christ compared to any worldly kind of power, especially when that worldly kind of power, as Sebastian just said, is one that is corrupt, doesn't follow the gospel values, doesn't follow United Nations, internationally accepted type of standards of behavior as well. So while I understand things from a political perspective, that there are laws and rules that people need to abide by, I think in this case, Sister Patricia is justified in her actions.
Oh, okay.
Yeah?
Well, one last comment though. I'm going to play the devil's advocate on this one. If hypothetically, I had a caregiver come in to take care of my mother who was sick, and this caregiver now starts criticizing me, the way I raise my family, what I feed my kids, and all these sort of things, wouldn't I have a right to kick her out of the house?
Are you beating your kids? Are you preventing them from being fed? There's no evidence that Sister Patricia is actually doing anything, as Alison alluded to, against international law. In fact, it's the exact opposite. She seems to be standing up with the people who have no voice, who have no power, which is always the position of the gospel.
That's perfect. All right, that's a good point. Thank you. We're going to move on now to our next story.
In a recent homily at Casa Santa Marta this week, the Pope spoke about the devil yet again, saying that the devil is a loser. Since a journalist quoted him as saying that hell does not exist, the Pope seems to have increased his frequency on the topic. In fact, in his newest apostolic exhortation, the devil gets a mention more than a dozen times throughout the document. Can talking about the devil too often hurt our progressive Pope's credibility?
And that's a very good question. I'm going to throw this one to you, Alison. If our Pope, who is so liberal, is reaching out to a whole generation of fall-away Catholics, don't you think that perhaps talking about the devil in such a way would sort of, lose his touch with the fall-away type of Catholics he's trying to attract?
Well, the first thing I want to address is the fact that Pope Francis speaks of the devil often, and it's not something that is new to this phase of his pontificate. Pope Francis has spoken of the devil all throughout since 2013, and he also is definitely very, misquoted in the media, and so I can understand why people would then think that talking about the devil is a reaction against that. I don't see it that way. Okay. However, I do wonder if speaking of the devil as this image of this man with red horns and it's a physical entity, it does a disservice to what the Pope is really trying to get across, which is that there is a force within this world that works in a malevolent way, that works in a way that is counter to the good and the true and the beautiful. And I think that it was C.S. Lewis who actually said that one of the most clever things the devil has ever done is to convince people that he doesn't exist.
Yes.
Exactly. And so I do wonder if there is a way to speak of the devil that captures more of what resonates with people. I don't think people looking around this world would say, no, evil doesn't exist in this world. Okay. You look at things like what we just talked about, the Duterte government, right? That's evil. In my opinion, that is an example of evil in this world. So I wish that Pope Francis would speak of the devil in terms that people could relate to on a bit more of a grassroots level.
So in his recent homily that happened on Monday, he spoke of the devil as a loser, as someone who tries to seduce, who gets... Are you suggesting that the Pope maybe should stay away from those typical images of the guy with the green horn or with the red horn with a pitchfork, or go something in a little more...
I think that in modern times you need to use modern methods. I think that speaking of evil in a corporeal form that has cloven hooves and, horns off his head, and he's a little red guy, is not relevant to most people. They will laugh at that. When what we should really be doing is laughing at evil in this world because Christ has overcome it.
So then I'm going to ask this question of Sebastian as a theologian, who has extensive knowledge on church history, church readings. How would you then suggest or maybe recommend to the Pope he tackle that idea of of the devil.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because in the same homily, you know, he made the analogy looking at Eve in the creation story, and he said, you know, Eve thought she was a great theologian because she opened this dialogue with the devil, you know, and catastrophe ensued. So Francis is not, it's not a simplistic kind of look at evil in the world. It's very complex. And Francis will even look at people who are, you know, highly educated or think of themselves as being very informed or have a lot of authority in the church. And he sees the devil, the evil at play in all of that, those false structures of power that people create, knowledge, you know, prestige, money, all these different things. So he you know, he talks so much about the devil because it's how Francis moves in the world. He's constantly discerning spirits. Like, he's walking around and he's seeing positive spirit here, fan the flames. Negative spirit here, I got to call that what it is. You know, like that's how he is seeing everything. The reality that he lives in is the real world, but it's also a spiritual world, and that's why he's so kind of spontaneous and open to positive things that happen, and he wants to encourage them. You know, and at the same time, when he sees something that's evil or something that's bad, he has to name it for what it is. It's not always, like Allison said, a tangible thing, but a lot of times it's, you know, it's the little things like gossiping or clinging to power, those kinds of things. And he sees that in the church as much as he sees it in the world. So it works both ways.
Any comments, Emily?
I will have to echo, unfortunately, what Sebastian is just saying. I was going to say Pope Francis has many times named those things that are evil, and I think that that is a way that he can identify more with people and bring them in, because I do think that he's aware that there's some language in our Catholic tradition that might not be relevant to the average person, right? And so he does make sure to be specific in the way that he names those evils. And he's done that for a very long time, since the beginning of his pontificate. So this isn't something new that Pope Francis is doing.
Good.
It's also he's very Catholic in this sense, you know, and he's coming from a particular culture, Latin American culture. He has a very strong kind of devotions, and he believes very strongly in the piety of ordinary Catholics. He puts a lot of emphasis on that. I mean, and his concern about the devil is part of that whole cultural Catholic experience that he's coming out of as a Latin American. That's how he talks about it. So it might not totally resonate with people from different parts of the world, like where we're from. It might not be the way that we would talk about it, but we have to just say, clearly he's concerned about the very real Catholic kind of understandings of the world, of the presence of good, of the presence of evil, and he's articulating it in the way that he knows how.
Okay, very good point. So thank you so much for those points. Now, before we move on to our next story, for those of you who would like to watch the rest of this episode, you can watch it on our website, but we would also very much like to hear your thoughts about what's being discussed today. So please feel free to send us a message on our social media, Twitter, Facebook, or on Instagram. So now let's move on to our next story, the last one for tonight.
The German's Bishop Conference recently approved a pastoral document that gives easier access to communion for Protestant spouses of Catholics. However, 7 bishops from that conference completely disagreed and have asked the Pope to intervene. Now, the Pope has come back and told the bishops to come together and find a consensus on guidelines which will allow Protestants to receive Eucharist in the Catholic Church. Is this the proverbial crack in the dam?
All right, is it a crack in the dam? I mean, you are a convert, Allison, so I'm going to throw this one to you. You went from being a Protestant to a Catholic. How does this make you feel that the possibility that maybe Protestants can have communion in the Catholic Church?
Well, I'm a pretty centrist Catholic, I would say. I don't really fall into one of the liberal or conservative camps, what we might talk about, these factions, but I actually agree with the conservatives on this one. I think that that is the proverbial crack in the dam. I think that if we open up our teaching to different ways of interpretation that fall outside of the magisterium of the church, that is a slippery slope. There are already defined guidelines in the Code of Canon Law, and that the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith oversees that say when Protestants can have communion, which is that it's a grave situation of death, Protestant spouses, I should say, like death or extreme injury that could lead to death, or another extreme and grave circumstance. And so, there are guidelines for when this kind of thing should happen. This should not even be a question. Just because Amoris Laetitia opened up different type of pastoral circumstances in that footnote that has caused such controversy doesn't mean that we should then be opening this up to a wider scope. I became a Catholic because I believe in the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. If you want to take Catholic communion, become a Catholic. Why are you not becoming Catholic if you don't believe that? If you want communion, it's nonsensical then for you to not become a Catholic. Just like I now don't walk into an Anglican, Episcopalian, Methodist church and take their communion because I don't believe in consubstantiation. So to me, this is madness.
Wow, okay.
Tell us how you really feel. I'm going to go a little bit of a different direction here with this. This is really interesting. So the German bishops are talking about this in Germany, whether or not they're going to open this up. There's 7 of those bishops who disagree. Were concerned and wrote a letter to Rome saying, we want the universal church to make, in other words, we want Peter to make have the deciding vote on this, because we think it's, as Allison's saying, a universal question. It's not something that we can just look at. Really interestingly, Francis's response when he met with the German bishops was, as much as possible, try to find a unanimous decision amongst yourselves. In other words,
what though? To what?
To answer the question about whether or not intercommunion can happen. And so Francis takes this request from these bishops and says, thank you very much, let me hand it right back to you. And this goes back to something this is really, really important to Francis, and it predates Amoris Laetitia. In Evangelii Gaudium, which was his first exhortation, he said, the full doctrinal potential, if you will, of bishops' conference has not been realized. That was something that was envisioned at the council, and it's something that has not materialized. I want to move toward that direction, the vision of the council, to give bishops' conferences real doctrinal authority. So I think Francis is looking at this as, no, it's up to them. The church exists in its fullness in a diocese, in a country, in a region. And he wants to give that doctrinal authority back to them as long as they can find a unanimous decision. So he wants them to obviously prod over it a little bit more and make a decision on their own.
So then here's my question. If they say, okay, fine, Protestants can receive Eucharistic in the Catholic Church, in Germany, does that apply in Canada or in the U.S.?
No, that's what I'm saying. I think he sees...
So it will be a regional decision.
Totally. And this question is going to come up again and again with a whole bunch of very controversial issues in the church, like women deacons, for example. They're already talking about married clergy in the Amazon, coming up for the synod on the Amazon, as a topic of discussion. If they approve that there, is Francis going to mandate that every diocese, every bishops' conference around the world has to have married clergy? No. But it's a pastoral need in that particular location. And that's the important thing here. In Germany, it's a pastoral need in a particular situation, and he thinks, as the council thought, that bishops have the authority, the doctrinal authority to make that decision.
For that particular region. That's very interesting, because then are we seeing then possibly a decentralization of authority in Rome on these doctrinal matters?
I mean, Pope Francis has talked about that before,
okay.
So this isn't, that word is something that's been talked, again, like I said, talked about before, right? But I don't think that it's really understood what that means. You're explaining it really well, Sebastian. I do think that it does open the door for the possibility of other bishops' conferences to open up that door as well, whether that be with communion for couples and mixed marriages, or, with Amoris Laetitia, we talked a lot about divorce or remarried, which is still not a close case, sort of speak, right? Yes. There's no unanimity. There's no real agreement as to what should be done with that particular issue. I think that there's some relationship between them. And so there is concern among Catholics that if there's no unanimous decision, if there's no clarity coming from Rome, then what does that mean for us, right? What if we feel that in our local church we have a need, but because it's not a unanimous thing across our country or then what is it for us, right? If they're allowed in Germany,
we'll move to Germany. Yeah.
You know, it just creates so much confusion,
Yeah.
and I understand where Pope Francis what he's saying. I think that he does see how the Spirit can work within, you know, by bringing people together and finding unity and through prayer. Like, I think that that's a very important exercise.
Yes.
However, us little folk, you know, we're sitting in our pews at Mass.
They're not so little.
No,
That's
we're
what
not-
Francis
yeah.
is trying to do. Like, he's trying to help move forward a process that had already started 50 years ago of the maturation of the Catholic Church in the modern world. And that means taking ownership. It means knowing what we think. It means having an opinion. It means trying to find, you know, a unanimous decision, as he said, if possible. Just one little thing I would point out. Let's say the German bishops go back and meet and close the door to this. They have a conversation, and
they say no.
The majority bishops actually come down to the other 7 bishops' position and say, maybe we shouldn't open it.
Right.
I think Francis would bless that. So this is not Francis trying to
Imposing
impose his own
agenda
of what he wants in terms of opening this door. He just wants to give the authority to
them
where
to
it
make
belongs,
it.
which is the Episcopal Conference.
Well, that's all that we have time for, guys. Thank you so much. It was a very interesting conversation. Again, if you would like to watch the rest of this show or like to catch repeats of this, you can watch it on our website listed below. But be sure to join us again next week on Perspectives 360 when we take a look at another of the top 4 stories that made the Catholic Church that week. Thank you for joining us.